Billionaire falls in love at first sight after seeing the black hotel Maid cleaning the hotel room. She was invisible to everyone else in the hotel, just another black woman in a housekeeping uniform. But when their eyes met through that doorway, Jonathan Blackwood saw the only person who could save him from drowning in his own success. Before we dive deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you are watching from. Hit subscribe if you are hooked in and ready to enjoy the story. Because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I do not want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Meridian Grand Hotel's penthouse suite. Jonathan Blackwood stood motionless, his Italian leather shoes planted on marble that cost more than most people's annual salary. The 34-year-old tech mogul stared at his reflection in the glass, seeing not the man who'd built a billion-dollar empire before 35, but the hollow-eyed stranger who hadn't slept properly in months. His phone buzzed incessantly on the black granite counter. Stock reports, board meeting reminders, investment opportunities that would add more zeros to an already incomprehensible fortune. Jonathan ignored them all, loosening his silk tie with fingers that trembled slightly. Not from caffeine, but from exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. "Another day in paradise," he muttered, his voice echoing in the sterile luxury that had become his prison. The penthouse was a monument to success and a mausoleum of loneliness. Every surface gleamed with perfection. Every piece of furniture had been selected by a team of designers who knew his net worth, but nothing about his soul. The space felt like a museum exhibit. The successful American male, circa 2025. 23 floors below, Amira Washington pushed her housekeeping cart down the carpeted hallway of the Meridian Grand, her movements efficient and purposeful despite the weight of exhaustion in her bones. At 28, she carried herself with a dignity that her uniform, crisp white shirt, black slacks, hair pulled back in a neat bun, couldn't diminish. The morning shift at the hotel was just her first job of the day. In 6 hours, she'd clock out and drive across town to the community college where she taught night classes in creative writing. After that, she'd spend 3 more hours cleaning offices downtown. The rhythm was brutal, but it was hers. "Room 2847, she whispered to herself, checking her assignment sheet. Another executive suite. Another reminder of the vast distance between her world and theirs. Amira had learned to navigate these spaces with invisible grace. She cleaned around silk ties that cost more than her monthly rent, dusted electronics that could fund her sister's medical school tuition, and straightened beds that probably cost more than her car. But she never let resentment poison her pride in honest work. Her phone buzzed, a text from her younger sister. "Thanks for the tuition money. You're my hero." Amira smiled, the first genuine expression she'd worn since her alarm clock screamed at 5 a.m. Back in the penthouse, Jonathan's assistant had called 3 times. Board members wanted answers about the Singapore expansion. His publicist needed quotes for the Forbes interview. His mother, if she could still be called that, had left a voicemail about some charity gala where his presence would look good for the family brand. None of it mattered. The deals that once thrilled him felt mechanical. The achievements that should have brought satisfaction instead felt like elaborate distractions from a growing emptiness that money couldn't fill. He'd built his empire by reading people, by understanding what motivated them, by anticipating their moves. But lately, he felt disconnected from humanity itself, as if success had elevated him so far above ordinary human experience that he could no longer remember what it felt like to be genuinely moved by anything. Jonathan walked to his private elevator, pressing the button for the 24th floor. He had a ritual, a strange one that his security team tolerated but didn't understand. Sometimes, when the loneliness became unbearable, he'd walk the hotel floors, not as an owner inspecting his property, but as a man searching for something he couldn't name. Amira knocked softly on room 2847's door, waited the required 30 seconds, then used her master key. The suite was empty, bed unmade, expensive suits draped carelessly over chairs. She began her methodical process, straightening, dusting, restoring order to chaos left by people who could afford to be careless. She hummed quietly while she worked, an old Etta James song her grandmother used to sing. The melody filled the silence, transforming the sterile space into something warmer, more human. As she reached to straighten the curtains, movement in the hallway caught her eye. A tall man in an expensive suit walked slowly past the doorway, his shoulders carrying a weight that had nothing to do with physical burden. For just a moment, their eyes might have met through the gap in the door. Neither Jonathan nor Amira could have predicted that this ordinary Tuesday morning would be the last time they'd walk through the world as separate people, unaware that someone existed who would change everything they thought they knew about love, worth, and what it meant to be truly seen. The stage was set. Two lives, running on parallel tracks through the same building, were about to collide in the most unexpected way. The collision happened on Thursday. Jonathan had dismissed his security detail that morning, a decision that would have horrified his team but felt necessary for his sanity. He needed to walk without an entourage, to move through space like a human being rather than a protected asset. He was returning from a disastrous board meeting where he'd rejected a merger that would have added another $2 billion to his portfolio. The executives had stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. The deal was perfect on paper: synergies, market dominance, shareholder value. Everything that should have excited him left him feeling hollow. Lost in thought, Jonathan rounded the corner toward the elevators and stopped abruptly. Room 2453's door stood ajar, and through the opening, he could see movement, graceful, purposeful, almost choreographed. Amira was making the bed, but she wasn't just pulling covers and fluffing pillows. She moved with an artist's precision, smoothing wrinkles with hands that seemed to understand the language of care itself. Sunlight from the window caught the elegant line of her neck as she leaned forward, concentration evident in every gesture. But it was when she began to sing that Jonathan's world tilted. Her voice was low, rich, carrying notes of yearning and hope that seemed to fill not just the room, but the hollow spaces in his chest he'd forgotten existed. The melody was unfamiliar, but the emotion was universal. Something about dreams deferred but not abandoned, about finding beauty in unexpected places. Jonathan found himself moving closer to the doorway, drawn by something he couldn't name. This wasn't the mechanical efficiency he expected from hotel staff. This was someone transforming a sterile space into something that felt like home. Amira sensed a presence and turned. The moment their eyes met, time performed an impossible trick. It both stopped completely and accelerated beyond measure. Jonathan saw intelligence in her dark eyes, strength in the set of her shoulders, and something else that hit him like a physical blow. She saw him. Not his net worth, not his reputation, not the carefully constructed public persona. She saw him as if she could look straight through the armor of success to the man underneath. For Amira, the sight of the tall stranger in the expensive suit should have triggered her usual professional politeness. Instead, she found herself looking into eyes that held unexpected vulnerability. This wasn't the arrogant entitlement she'd learned to expect from the wealthy men who frequented the hotel. There was loneliness there, a longing that mirrored something in her own heart. "I'm sorry," Jonathan said, his voice rougher than intended. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting," Amira replied, though her heart was racing for reasons she couldn't explain. "Is there something you need?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities neither dared acknowledge. Was there something he needed? Everything, Jonathan thought. Absolutely everything. "I heard you singing," he said instead. "It was beautiful." Heat rose in Amira's cheeks. Guests weren't supposed to notice the help, and the help certainly wasn't supposed to be caught singing while working. "I apologize if I was being too loud." "Don't apologize." The words came out more intense than Jonathan intended. "Please don't apologize for bringing something beautiful into the world." They stood in the doorway of room 2453, two people from different universes, experiencing something that felt like recognition. As if they'd been waiting their entire lives for this moment without knowing it. Amira should have returned to her work. Jonathan should have continued to the elevator. Instead, they remained frozen in a moment that felt both eternal and fragile. What was the song? Jonathan asked, stepping slightly closer. Something my grandmother used to sing, Amira said, her voice softer now. About finding light in dark places. She sounds wise. She was. Amira's eyes held a sadness that made Jonathan want to reach out, to offer comfort, to somehow ease whatever pain lived behind that beautiful voice. The silence stretched between them, filled with electricity and possibility, and the terrifying recognition that something fundamental had just shifted in both their worlds. I should let you work, Jonathan said finally, though every instinct screamed at him to stay. Yes, Amira agreed, though she made no move to turn away. I should work. Neither moved. The moment was broken by the sharp ring of Jonathan's phone. Reality crashed back. Board meetings, conference calls, the machinery of his empire that required constant attention. He glanced at the screen, his assistant, probably wondering where he'd disappeared to. When he looked back up, Amira had already turned away, her hands busy with tasks that suddenly seemed mechanical after the electricity of their connection. I'm Jonathan, he said to her back. She paused, not turning around. Amira. Amira, he repeated, the name feeling like something precious on his tongue. He walked away then, toward the elevator, toward his responsibilities, toward the life that suddenly felt like an elaborate construction designed to keep him for moments exactly like this one. But as the elevator doors closed, Jonathan carried with him the image of Amira's eyes, the sound of her voice, and the devastating recognition that he'd just met the person who could change everything, if he was brave enough to let her. In room 2453, Amira continued her work with hands that trembled slightly, humming the same song but finding that the melody now carried new possibilities she was afraid to name. Neither could have known that this 30-second encounter would haunt their dreams and reshape their understanding of what it meant to be truly alive. Jonathan couldn't concentrate. 3 days had passed since the encounter in room 2453, and he'd attempted to bury himself in work with the desperate intensity of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. Board meetings blurred together. Investment reports remained unread on his desk. His assistant had rescheduled the same conference call 4 times because he kept staring out windows, searching hotel corridors, listening for the echo of a voice that had somehow rewired his entire nervous system. This is insane, he muttered to himself, pacing the length of his penthouse office. You don't even know her. But that wasn't true. In 30 seconds, he'd learned more about Amira than he knew about women he'd dated for months. The way she moved with unconscious grace. The intelligence that flickered in her eyes. The pride she carried despite circumstances that would have broken lesser people. The voice that could make a hotel room feel like a sanctuary. His phone buzzed with another missed call from Victoria Ashford, the socialite his mother had been pushing him toward for months. Beautiful, accomplished, from the right family, everything that should have mattered. The thought of returning her call made him feel claustrophobic. Jonathan found himself standing at his window, looking down at the hotel's service entrance 23 floors below. Somewhere in this building, Amira was working, probably singing to herself, transforming sterile spaces into something that felt like home. The rational part of his mind, the part that had built an empire, cataloged all the reasons this obsession was dangerous. The class difference, the racial dynamics that would invite scrutiny and judgment, the potential for exploitation accusations that could destroy both their reputations. The simple fact that a billionaire falling for a hotel Maid was a cliché that tabloids would devour. But every logical argument crumbled when he remembered the moment their eyes met. Meanwhile, Amira was fighting her own war. She'd requested a transfer to a different floor, a decision her supervisor questioned but ultimately approved. Working the executive suites on the 15th floor meant smaller tips and less prestigious assignments, but it also meant avoiding the 24th floor where she might encounter the man who'd turned her carefully ordered world upside down. Girl, you've been acting strange all week, her coworker Denise observed as they shared lunch in the employee break room. "What's got you so distracted?" "Nothing," Amira lied, stabbing at her salad with unnecessary force. "Just tired." But tiredness didn't explain why she'd caught herself humming that old song constantly, or why she'd startled every time she heard expensive shoes on marble, or why she'd dreamed 3 nights running about dark eyes that seemed to see straight through her defenses. Denise wasn't fooled. This wouldn't have anything to do with that fine man in the expensive suit who's been asking about you. Amira's fork clattered against her plastic container. "What man?" "Tall, dark hair. Looks like he could buy and sell half of California. He's been asking the cleaning supervisors about you. Very discreet, very polite, but definitely asking." Heat flooded Amira's face. "He's asking about me?" "Honey, that man is interested. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" "Nothing," Amira said firmly. "Absolutely nothing." But even as she spoke the words, her heart was racing. He was asking about her, which meant she wasn't imagining the connection, wasn't projecting romance onto a simple moment of eye contact, which made it infinitely more dangerous. Amira had learned early that wealthy men who paid attention to women like her rarely had honorable intentions. Her mother had cleaned houses for rich families, had witnessed firsthand how the wives looked through her like she was invisible while their husbands made comments that left her feeling dirty and small. "Men like that don't fall in love with women like us," her mother had warned. "They collect us, use us, throw us away when they get bored." The warning echoed in Amira's mind as she returned to work, determined to avoid any possibility of another encounter. She changed her schedule, took different routes through the hotel, kept her head down and her guard up. But fate, or perhaps Jonathan's persistence, had other plans. Thursday afternoon, Amira was restocking towels in a supply closet when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Something about the rhythm, the weight of expensive shoes on the carpet, made her freeze. "Excuse me." His voice, deep, careful, closer than she'd expected. Amira turned slowly, finding Jonathan standing in the doorway of the supply closet. Up close, he was even more devastating, tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, but something in his posture suggested he was trying to make himself smaller, less imposing. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, surprised that she remembered his name from the hotel's VIP guest list. "You know who I am. It's my job to know who our important guests are." The word guests hung between them like a wall, a reminder of their different stations, different worlds, different expectations. "I've been hoping to see you again," Jonathan said, his honesty so raw it made Amira's chest tight. "I don't think that's appropriate, sir." "Sir." He winced. "Don't call me sir. It's protocol. Forget protocol for a minute. Please." But Amira couldn't forget the protocol. The protocol was armor. The protocol was safety. Protocol was the thin line that protected women like her from men like him. "I should get back to work," she said, moving to step around him. Jonathan didn't block her path, but his presence filled the narrow doorway. "Will you have coffee with me?" The question hit her like a physical blow. Simple words that carried the weight of impossible possibilities. "No," she said quickly. "I can't. Can't or won't. Both." She brushed past him, her arm accidentally grazing his chest, and the brief contact sent electricity shooting through her entire body. Jonathan felt it too. She could see it in the way his breath caught, the way his hands clenched at his sides. Amira walked quickly down the hallway, feeling his eyes on her back, knowing that she was running from more than just an inappropriate proposition. She was running from the terrifying recognition that everything her mother had warned her about might be wrong. And that might be the most dangerous possibility of all. The storm hit California with unprecedented fury on a Tuesday that had started deceptively calm. Amira was finishing her shift on the 15th floor when the first emergency alert blared through the hotel's PA system. Flash flood warnings. Mandatory shelter protocols. All guests and staff were to remain in the building until further notice. She'd been cleaning the conference room when the lights flickered and died, plunging the space into an eerie twilight illuminated only by emergency lighting. The elevators shut down automatically. The stairwells were deemed unsafe due to structural concerns in the older sections of the building. All staff report to designated safety zones, the announcement continued. This is not a drill. Amira gathered her supplies quickly, muscle memory guiding her through the darkened hallway toward the nearest safety zone, the 24th floor executive lounge. Her heart sank as she realized where she was heading, but protocol was protocol, and she wasn't about to risk her job by ignoring safety procedures. The executive lounge was already filled with stranded guests and staff when she arrived. Emergency lighting cast long shadows across the elegant space, transforming the usually pristine environment into something that felt suspended between worlds. And there, standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows watching sheets of rain assault the glass, was Jonathan. He turned when she entered, and their eyes met across the crowded room with the same electric recognition that had marked their first encounter. But this time, there was nowhere to run. "Looks like we're stuck," said Tom, the night security supervisor, addressing the room. "Could be several hours before we get the all clear. We've got emergency supplies, backup generators for essential lighting, and the kitchen staff managed to bring up some food before the elevators shut down." Amira found a spot near the back of the room, as far from Jonathan as possible while still remaining in the designated safe zone. She pulled out her phone to text her sister, letting her know she'd be late for their dinner plans, but discovered the cell towers were down. The first hour passed in a tense quiet. Staff and guests clustered in separate groups, the usual invisible barriers between them more pronounced in the strange intimacy of shared vulnerability. Amira helped distribute bottled water and emergency snacks, grateful for tasks that kept her hands busy and her mind off the man whose presence she could feel like heat radiating across the room. The second hour brought restlessness. Conversations grew louder as people tried to distract themselves from the storm raging outside. Some guests complained about missed appointments and business deals. Others worried about flights and family members. It was during the third hour that everything changed. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly guest staying in the presidential suite, began showing signs of distress. She was sitting alone near the window, her breathing shallow and rapid, one hand pressed to her chest. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Amira asked, abandoning her post to kneel beside the older woman. "My medication," Mrs. Patterson gasped. "In my room. I need my heart medication." The hotel manager was immediately called over, but the situation was clear. The elevators were down, the stairwells were unsafe, and Mrs. Patterson's room was 7 floors up. The emergency medical kit in the lounge didn't contain the specific medication she needed. "We've called emergency services," the manager said, "but with the flooding, response times are severely delayed." Mrs. Patterson's condition was worsening. Her lips were taking on a bluish tint, her breathing becoming more labored. "I can get to her room," Jonathan said suddenly, his voice cutting through the worried murmurs. Everyone turned to stare at him. "Sir, the stairwells," the manager began. "I know this building better than anyone," Jonathan interrupted. "I own it. I know which stairwells are structurally sound and which routes are safest. I can get to the presidential suite and back." "It's too dangerous," the manager protested. "She'll die if she doesn't get that medication," Jonathan said flatly. "What room number, Mrs. Patterson?" But Mrs. Patterson was barely conscious now, her words unintelligible. "I know which room," Amira said quietly. "I cleaned it this morning. 2947. The medication will be in the bathroom cabinet. Heart patients always keep it close to the sink." Jonathan's eyes found hers across the room. "You can't come with me. You'll never find it without me," Amira replied, standing up. "Heart medications look alike, and you don't know which one she needs. I've seen her take it. I know exactly what to look for." "Absolutely not," Jonathan said, his voice sharp with fear that had nothing to do with the dangerous building. "I won't risk." "It's not your choice," Amira cut him off, her voice strong and clear. "Mrs. Patterson needs that medication, and you need someone who knows exactly where to find it." The room fell silent except for the storm outside and Mrs. Patterson's labored breathing. Everyone understood the stakes. A woman's life hung in the balance, and the only way to save her required two people from opposite ends of the social spectrum to trust each other completely. "The emergency stairs in the north wing," Jonathan said finally, his resistance crumbling in the face of medical necessity. "They're the safest route." "I'll get the flashlights," Amira said. As they prepared for the dangerous journey, Amira felt the weight of every eye in the room. Staff members who'd worked alongside her for years watched with mixture of concern and confusion. Wealthy guests observed with curiosity and judgment. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was Mrs. Patterson's increasingly desperate breathing, and the fact that she and Jonathan were about to venture into a dark, potentially unstable building together. Not as a billionaire and a maid, but as two people trying to save a life. "Ready?" Jonathan asked, testing his flashlight. "Ready," Amira replied. They left the safety of the lounge together, stepping into darkness that felt both dangerous and somehow inevitable, as if the storm had been conspiring all along to force them into a situation where pretense and social barriers became meaningless in the face of human need. Behind them, Mrs. Patterson's breathing grew more shallow, marking time they didn't have to waste. The journey through the darkened hotel felt like navigating a haunted maze. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows as Jonathan and Amira made their way through corridors that felt alien in the storm's grip. Their flashlights created moving pools of light that revealed familiar spaces transformed into something mysterious and otherworldly. "This way," Jonathan said, guiding them toward the north stairwell. 29 floors. "Are you sure about this?" "Mrs. Patterson doesn't have a choice," Amira replied, though her heart was pounding. "Neither do we." They climbed in focused silence for the first several flights, their breathing synchronized, flashlight beams dancing ahead of them. But as they paused on the 19th floor landing to catch their breath, the weight of their isolation, two people alone in a vast, dark building, began to settle around them. "How do you know so much about Mrs. Patterson's medication?" Jonathan asked, leaning against the concrete wall. "My grandmother had the same condition," Amira said, checking her watch. They'd been climbing for 15 minutes. "I spent 3 years helping care for her before she passed." "You learn to recognize the signs, the medications, the emergency protocols." "I'm sorry." "Don't be." She lived to 93 and told stories until the very end. She used to say that every ending was just a new beginning in disguise. They resumed climbing, but something had shifted in the quality of silence between them. The shared danger, the physical exertion, the strange intimacy of emergency had lowered their defenses. "Can I ask you something?" Amira said as they reached the 22nd floor. "Anything. Why do you really walk the hotel floors? Tom mentioned that you do it regularly, but you don't inspect anything. You just walk." Jonathan's flashlight beam wavered slightly. They'd stopped climbing again, standing in the narrow stairwell that suddenly felt like a confessional booth. "My parents owned this hotel before I bought it from them," he said finally. "When I was a kid, maybe 8 or 9, they used to bring me here on weekends while they worked. I'd wander the halls for hours while they were in meetings. That sounds lonely." It was. But I discovered something during those long walks. I could hear people's real lives through the doors. Families laughing, couples fighting and making up, business deals that would change everything. People being human in ways my parents never allowed themselves to be. Amira listened, understanding flooding through her. "You're looking for that feeling again. Pathetic, isn't it? A grown man wandering hotel corridors, hoping to accidentally witness authentic human emotion." "It's not pathetic," Amira said softly. "It's heartbreaking." They climbed in silence for 2 more floors before Jonathan spoke again. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 25, he said. They were rushing to a business dinner. Always rushing to the next deal, the next acquisition, the next thing that mattered more than being present for their own lives. Is that why you bought the hotel? I thought if I owned it, I could somehow recapture those moments when I felt connected to real human experience. Instead, I just created a more expensive prison." They'd reached the 26th floor. 3 more to go, But Amira found herself wanting to slow down, to extend this strange intimacy of shared vulnerability. "What about you?" Jonathan asked. "How does someone with your intelligence and grace end up cleaning hotel rooms?" The question stung, though she could tell he didn't mean it to. "You assume I ended up here by accident or failure. I didn't mean. I choose to work here," Amira said, her voice stronger now. "I have a degree in literature from UC Berkeley. I teach night classes at the community college. I'm working on my master's degree. And I clean hotel rooms because honest work has dignity, no matter what form it takes." Jonathan stopped climbing entirely. "I'm an ass." "Yes, you are. But you're learning. Why literature?" "Because stories matter. Because someone needs to teach kids that their voices have value, that their experiences deserve to be heard and preserved." They'd reached Mrs. Patterson's floor. Jonathan used his master keycard to unlock the stairwell door, and they stepped into the hallway. Even with flashlights, the darkness felt oppressive. "Room 2947, Amira said. "Down here." As they walked toward Mrs. Patterson's room, Jonathan found himself seeing Amira with completely new eyes. Not a hotel maid who happened to be beautiful, but an educator, a writer, a woman who'd chosen to work multiple jobs to pursue her dreams while supporting her family. "I need to tell you something," he said as they reached the door. "Before we go in there." Amira turned, her face illuminated by the crossing beams of their flashlights. "I've been thinking about you constantly since we met," Jonathan said, his voice raw with honesty. "Not because you're some fantasy or conquest, but because you're the first real person I've encountered in years. The first person who looked at me and saw a human being instead of a bank account. Jonathan, I know it's impossible. I know there are 100 reasons why this is complicated and potentially destructive. But I need you to know that what I feel isn't some rich man's whim. It's the first genuine emotion I've experienced in longer than I can remember." Amira stared at him in the strange half-light, seeing vulnerability and sincerity in his eyes that completely dismantled every defensive assumption she'd built around men like him. "We need to get that medication," she said finally. "I know. Mrs. Patterson is dying. I know. But after this is over, we need to talk." Jonathan's heart stopped. "We do." "Yes," Amira said, reaching for the door handle. "Because you're not the only one who's been thinking constantly about someone they barely know." They entered Mrs. Patterson's room together, both understanding that they were crossing more than just a threshold. They were entering territory where their carefully constructed worlds would never be the same. They found Mrs. Patterson's medication exactly where Amira had predicted. In the bathroom cabinet, a small bottle of nitroglycerin tablets that could mean the difference between life and death. The journey back down 29 floors felt different from their ascent. The emergency was still urgent, but something had fundamentally shifted between them during their conversation in the darkness. They moved with synchronized purpose, no longer two strangers thrown together by circumstance, but partners united by shared mission and unexpected understanding. "Almost there," Jonathan said as they reached the 10th floor, though both of them seemed reluctant to return to the world of watching eyes and social expectations waiting in the executive lounge. When they burst through the doors, Mrs. Patterson was barely conscious. Amira immediately knelt beside her, gently placing a nitroglycerin tablet under the elderly woman's tongue while Jonathan explained to the anxious crowd what they'd found. "You need to sit still, Mrs. Patterson," Amira said softly, her voice carrying the authority of experience. "The medication needs a few minutes to work. Just breathe slowly." Within 10 minutes, color began returning to Mrs. Patterson's face. Her breathing steadied, and her eyes focused more clearly. "Thank you," she whispered, reaching for Amira's hand. "Both of you. You saved my life." The room erupted in relieved murmurs and scattered applause, but Jonathan only had eyes for Amira, who was still kneeling beside Mrs. Patterson, checking her pulse with gentle competence. "How did you know exactly what to do?" asked Dr. Martinez, a guest who'd identified himself as a physician earlier in the evening. "My grandmother," Amira explained simply. 3 years of managing her heart condition taught me more about emergency cardiac care than I ever wanted to know. As Mrs. Patterson was settled more comfortably and Dr. Martinez took over her monitoring, the crisis atmosphere in the lounge began to ease. But the storm outside showed no signs of abating, and the announcement came that they'd be sheltering in place until morning. The hotel staff began organizing sleeping arrangements. Blankets and pillows appeared from storage. The kitchen staff, who'd been stranded along with everyone else, managed to create an improvised dinner from emergency supplies. Jonathan found himself helping to distribute food, an activity so far removed from his usual experience that several guests did double takes seeing the billionaire owner serving sandwiches and coffee. But he was driven by something deeper than noblesse oblige. He wanted to be useful, to contribute, to be part of the human community rather than simply its benefactor. "This is surreal," he admitted to Amira as they worked side by side, handing out supplies. "I've never actually served food to anyone in my life." "It shows," Amira said with gentle amusement, watching him struggle with the coffee dispenser. "Here, let me." Her hands covered his as she guided him through the process, and the simple contact sent electricity through both of them. They were standing close enough that he could smell her shampoo, something simple and clean that was infinitely more appealing than the expensive perfumes he was accustomed to. "Better?" she asked, though she made no move to step away. "Much," he said, though he was no longer talking about the coffee. As the evening progressed, an unusual atmosphere developed in the executive lounge. The storm had stripped away normal social hierarchies. Wealthy guests found themselves sharing blankets with hotel staff. A tech CEO helped a housekeeper set up sleeping areas. The forced intimacy of the emergency had revealed everyone's fundamental humanity. Jonathan and Amira gravitated toward each other naturally, ending up sitting side by side on a makeshift bed of cushions near the windows, watching lightning illuminate the flooded city below. "I keep thinking about what you said earlier," Amira said quietly, her voice barely audible above the storm. "About walking the halls looking for authentic human experience. And you've been looking in the wrong places." Jonathan turned to study her profile in the emergency lighting. "Where should I have been looking?" "Not through keyholes and doorways," she said, meeting his gaze. "In mirrors. In conversations. In taking risks that matter. Like climbing 29 floors in a dangerous building with someone I barely know. Like admitting you're lonely to someone who might understand." The honesty in her voice was devastating. "Are you lonely, Amira?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. "I'm surrounded by people all day, students, co-workers, family. But yes, I'm lonely. I've been protecting myself so carefully from men who might hurt me that I've forgotten how to recognize one who might not." "And you think I might not hurt you?" "I think you're just as scared as I am," she said simply. People who want to hurt others aren't usually terrified of their own feelings. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the storm rage outside. Around them, the makeshift community of stranded people settled into sleep, but neither Jonathan nor Amira felt ready to close their eyes. "Tell me about your writing," Jonathan said. "Tell me about your real dreams," Amira countered. "Not the empire you built, but the life you actually wanted." So they talked. In whispers that wouldn't disturb the sleeping forms around them, they shared pieces of themselves they'd never offered to anyone else. Amira told him about the novel she was writing, about her students who reminded her daily why stories mattered. Jonathan admitted that he'd once wanted to be a teacher himself, that he'd dreamed of building schools instead of profit margins. "What stopped you?" she asked. "Fear," he said simply. "My parents' voices telling me that idealism was a luxury we couldn't afford. That money was the only security worth having. And now I realize that all the security in the world doesn't matter if you're too afraid to live." As dawn began to break through the storm clouds, emergency services finally gave the all-clear. The lights came back on, elevators resumed operation, and the strange spell of the night began to lift. But as Jonathan and Amira helped pack up the emergency supplies, both of them knew that something fundamental had changed. They'd spent 12 hours discovering that the connection they'd felt wasn't an illusion or attraction based on forbidden fruit. It was recognition, soul-deep and terrifying and real. The question now was what they would do about it. The photograph appeared in the California Society pages 3 days after the storm. It was grainy, clearly taken with a phone camera in low light, but unmistakable. Jonathan Blackwood and Amira Washington sitting close together during the hotel emergency, her hand on his arm, their faces turned toward each other with an intimacy that spoke volumes. The headline was cruel in its simplicity. Billionaire's stormy night, tech mogul cozy with hotel staff during emergency. Amira discovered it when her sister called, sobbing, at 6 in the morning. "They're saying horrible things about you online," Jasmine cried. The comments. "Amira, some of them are so racist, so vicious. They're calling you a gold digger, saying you planned this whole thing." Amira's hands shook as she pulled up the article on her phone. The photo hit her like a physical blow. Not because it was untrue, but because it reduced the most honest conversation of her life to tabloid fodder. The comment section was exactly as brutal as Jasmine had warned. Strangers were dissecting her motives, her character, her worth with the casual cruelty that social media enabled. Her phone rang constantly. Unknown numbers. Reporters. Her supervisor at the hotel, asking if she could come in early for an urgent meeting. But the call that destroyed her came at 8 a.m. "Miss Washington, this is Patricia Stern from the community college." The voice was crisp, professional, and utterly without warmth. "We need to discuss your teaching position." Amira's stomach dropped. "What about it? Given the recent publicity surrounding your relationship with Mr. Blackwood, the administration feels it's best if you take a leave of absence. Indefinitely." "A leave of absence?" Amira's voice rose. "For what? I've done nothing wrong. The college has a reputation to maintain. Our donors and board members are concerned about the optics of employing someone involved in this type of media attention." "This type of media attention?" Amira repeated, fury building in her chest. "You mean being photographed having a conversation? Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be, Miss Washington. Your final paycheck will be available Monday." The line went dead. Amira stared at her phone, the full magnitude of the disaster beginning to crystallize. In less than 12 hours, a single photograph had cost her the teaching job she loved, turned her private moment of connection into public spectacle, and painted her as either a predator or a victim, depending on which narrative the viewer preferred. She was still processing the devastation when her hotel supervisor called. "Amira, I'm sorry, but the corporation has made a decision. Given the media attention, they feel it's best if we part ways." "You're firing me?" "We're letting you go with 2 weeks severance and a positive reference letter." "But Amira, you have to understand. Mr. Blackwood is the owner. The optics of this situation are impossible for us to navigate. 2 jobs are gone. Her reputation was shredded. Her private feelings were exposed and twisted into something ugly and calculating." Meanwhile, Jonathan was facing his own crisis 23 floors above. His lawyer, his publicist, and his mother had arrived for an emergency meeting that felt more like an intervention. The conference table was covered with newspapers, printouts of online articles, and preliminary damage control strategies. "This is a disaster, Jonathan," his publicist, Rachel Kim, said bluntly. "Your stock price dropped 3 points this morning. The Singapore partners are reconsidering the deal, and the board is asking questions." "Questions about what?" Jonathan demanded, though his attention kept drifting to the grainy photograph. In the image, Amira looked beautiful and genuine. He looked like a man who'd found something precious. The media had turned it into something tawdry. "About your judgment," his mother, Victoria Blackwood, said coolly. "About whether you're fit to run a publicly traded company if you're making decisions with your hormones instead of your brain." "I'm not making decisions with." "Really?" Victoria slid another newspaper across the table. "Because this editorial suggests that you're either exploiting a vulnerable employee or allowing yourself to be manipulated by someone seeking financial gain. Neither option reflects well on your leadership capabilities." Jonathan's lawyer, David Chun, cleared his throat. We need to discuss legal exposure. If Ms. Washington decides to claim sexual harassment or exploitation, given the power dynamics involved. Stop, Jonathan said sharply. Amira would never. You don't know what she would do, Victoria interrupted. You've known this woman for less than a week. The family fortune that 4 generations built is not worth risking for an infatuation. Rachel leaned forward. We have a statement prepared. You can express regret for any misunderstanding, clarify that your interaction was purely professional, and distance yourself from any romantic implications. In other words, throw her under the bus to save my reputation. In other words, behave like the CEO of a billion-dollar corporation instead of a teenager with a crush, his mother snapped. Jonathan studied the faces around the table. People whose job was to protect his interests, who saw Amira not as a human being, but as a threat to be neutralized. The rational part of his mind understood their logic. The man who'd spent 12 hours discovering what authentic connection felt like wanted to throw them all out of his office. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mr. Blackwood, this is Amira. Please don't contact me again. What happened between us was a mistake. The words hit him like a physical blow. He stared at the message, understanding flooding through him. She'd lost her job. Her reputation was being destroyed. And she was protecting herself the only way she could, by severing all connection to the man whose attention had made her a target. Sir. Rachel was waiting for his decision about the statement. Jonathan looked at the photograph again, at Amira's face in the moment before the world decided to punish her for existing in his orbit. He thought about her voice in the darkness, her hands guiding him as she taught him to pour coffee, her confession that she'd been thinking about him constantly. Then he thought about the text message, the finality in those words, the door closing on the most real thing he'd ever experienced. Prepare the statement, he said quietly. The room exhaled with relief, but Jonathan felt something inside him break apart. He was choosing safety over truth, reputation over love, the familiar prison of wealth over the terrifying possibility of authentic human connection. As his team began planning his public retreat from scandal, Jonathan understood that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. But he couldn't see another way forward that wouldn't destroy them both. For 3 days, Jonathan lived in the aftermath of his cowardice. The statement had been released. Carefully worded, legally vetted, it painted their connection as a misunderstood moment of gratitude following Mrs. Patterson's rescue. Mr. Blackwood appreciates the professionalism of all hotel staff during the emergency situation and regrets any misinterpretation of his appreciation for their service. The media moved on to other scandals. His stock price recovered. The Singapore deal was back on track. His mother declared the crisis successfully managed. Jonathan felt like he was dying from the inside out. He sat in his penthouse office, staring at quarterly reports that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Every number, every projection, every strategic decision felt meaningless against the memory of Amira's voice in the darkness saying, "You're not the only one who's been thinking constantly about someone they barely know." His assistant knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a liberty she only took during true emergencies. "Sir, there's something you need to see." She placed a tablet on his desk, opened to a video that had been posted on social media an hour earlier. The title read, "The Real Story, a Response to Recent Media Coverage." Amira's face filled the screen. She was sitting in what looked like a modest apartment, wearing a simple blue sweater, her hair pulled back in the same neat style she'd worn at the hotel. But her eyes held a strength and dignity that made Jonathan's chest constrict with longing and shame. "My name is Amira Washington," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I'm a teacher, a graduate student, and until recently, I worked as a housekeeper at the Meridian Grand Hotel. I'm making this video because silence in the face of lies becomes complicity." Jonathan leaned forward, his heart hammering. 3 days ago, a photograph appeared showing me in conversation with Jonathan Blackwood during an emergency situation at the hotel. The media has chosen to characterize this interaction as either evidence of my gold-digging manipulation or his exploitation of power dynamics. Both narratives are false, and both are rooted in assumptions about what a black woman working in service could possibly offer a wealthy white man beyond sexual availability. Her words hit like surgical strikes, each one precisely aimed at the heart of the ugliness that had exploded around them. The truth is simpler and more radical than the media wants to acknowledge. Two human beings recognized something authentic in each other. We spent one night talking about dreams, fears, and the courage it takes to be genuinely vulnerable with another person. We discovered that connection doesn't respect boundaries of class or race or social expectation. Jonathan's hands were shaking as he watched her speak with the eloquence and power he'd glimpsed during their midnight conversation. Mr. Blackwood owes me nothing. He didn't promise me money or position or security. He offered something far more rare and valuable. He saw me as a complete human being rather than a caricature defined by my job title. In return, I saw him not as a bank account with a pulse, but as a man struggling with loneliness and searching for authentic connection. She paused, and Jonathan could see the emotions she was fighting to control. I've lost 2 jobs since that photograph appeared. Not because I did anything unprofessional or inappropriate, but because our society is more comfortable with stories that reduce complex human beings to stereotypes. The successful black woman must be calculating. The wealthy white man must be predatory. The possibility that we might simply have recognized kindred spirits in each other threatens narratives that keep us all in our assigned boxes. Jonathan was standing now, pacing his office, feeling something fundamental shifting inside his chest. I don't regret the conversation we had. I don't regret the connection we felt. What I regret is living in a world where that connection became a liability rather than a gift, where our honesty with each other was weaponized against us both. She looked directly into the camera, and Jonathan felt as if she were speaking directly to him across the 23 floors that separated them. I believe in love that transcends barriers. I believe in the courage to choose authenticity over safety. I believe that 2 people who see each other clearly have a responsibility to protect what they've found, even when the world wants to tear it apart. Her voice softened. But belief requires action, and action requires courage. The question isn't whether love can conquer all. It's whether we're brave enough to let it try. The video ended. Jonathan stared at the blank screen, Amira's words echoing in his mind. Then he was moving, grabbing his jacket, ignoring his assistant's questions about his afternoon appointments. He took the stairs, needing the physical exertion to channel the energy coursing through his body. 23 flights down, his mind racing with everything he needed to say, everything he should have said 3 days ago. But when he reached the lobby, he discovered that Amira was gone. She cleared out her locker this morning. Tom, the security supervisor, told him. Said she was leaving California, starting fresh somewhere else. Where? Jonathan demanded. She didn't say, sir. But she left this for you. Tom handed him an envelope with his name written in Amira's careful handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address and a brief note. If you decide that courage matters more than safety, I'll be here for 1 more day. If not, I understand. Thank you for showing me what it feels like to be truly seen. Jonathan looked at the address. A small town 3 hours north of the city. He checked his watch, 4 p.m. If he left now, if he drove through the night, he could reach her before she disappeared from his life forever. The choice was crystalline in its simplicity. Comfort and safety and the life he'd always known, or risk and vulnerability and the terrifying possibility of becoming the man he'd glimpsed in Amira's eyes. Jonathan walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the marble lobby, each step taking him further from the prison of his old life and closer to something that felt like freedom. He was choosing courage. Finally, Jonathan drove through the night like a man racing toward salvation. The address led him to a small coastal town north of San Francisco, where fog rolled in from the Pacific and Victorian houses perched on cliffs overlooking the endless gray-blue expanse of ocean. He found the bed and breakfast as the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of gold and coral that seemed to promise new beginnings. The seaside haven was exactly the kind of place that existed in movies about people escaping their old lives to find themselves. White clapboard siding, wraparound porch, gardens that looked tended by someone who understood that beauty could be simple and profound. Jonathan sat in his car for a full 5 minutes, his hands gripping the steering wheel, heart hammering with the kind of fear he hadn't felt since he was 8 years old, and standing outside his parents' office, hoping they'd notice he existed. The door opened before he could knock. Amira stood in the doorway wearing jeans and a cream-colored sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders, and Jonathan felt the same electric recognition that had marked their first meeting. But this time, instead of surprise in her eyes, he saw something that looked like hope tempered by wariness. "You came," she said softly. "I watched your video," Jonathan replied. "You were magnificent." "I was terrified," she admitted, stepping aside to let him in. "But I couldn't let their version of our story be the only one that existed." The interior of the bed and breakfast was warm and welcoming, filled with the kind of comfortable furniture that invited long conversations and the scent of coffee and cinnamon that suggested someone understood the art of hospitality. They were alone, the other guests apparently still sleeping or already out exploring the town. "I need to tell you something," Jonathan said, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. "I failed you. When the story broke, when the pressure mounted, I chose safety over truth. I let them release that statement." "I know," Amira interrupted gently. "I read it. It was cowardice. Pure cowardice. And it cost you everything." Amira moved to the kitchen, pouring coffee with the same graceful efficiency he remembered from the hotel. "It cost me 2 jobs and some public humiliation. But it also showed me something important." "What?" "That I'm stronger than I thought. That my worth isn't determined by other people's opinions. And that authentic connection is worth fighting for, even when fighting is terrifying." She handed him a mug, their fingers brushing in the exchange that sent familiar electricity through both of them. "I resigned from the company yesterday," Jonathan said. Amira's eyes widened. "What?" "I turned over operational control to the board and cashed out my majority stake. I'm keeping enough to be comfortable, but I'm done building empires that make me feel empty." "Jonathan, you didn't have to." "Yes, I did," he said firmly. "I spent my entire adult life hiding behind wealth and success, using them as excuses to avoid authentic human connection. You showed me what I was missing, what I was too afraid to reach for." They sat at the small kitchen table, morning light streaming through windows that framed a view of the ocean. The silence between them felt different from the charged tension of their first encounters. Deeper, more settled, full of possibility rather than barriers. "What will you do now?" Amira asked. "I don't know," Jonathan admitted, and the uncertainty felt liberating rather than terrifying. "Maybe teach. Maybe build schools instead of profit margins. Maybe learn how to be useful in ways that matter. And us?" The question hung between them, vulnerable and essential. Jonathan reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "I love you," he said simply. "I know it's too soon and too complicated, and probably too many things to make sense. But I love your strength and your voice and the way you see the world. I love how you make me want to be better than I am." Tears gathered in Amira's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "Which terrifies me, because love shouldn't happen this fast or feel this right or make everything else in life suddenly make sense. But it does. But it does." Jonathan stood, drawing her up with him, and when she stepped into his arms it felt like coming home to a place he'd never known existed. He kissed her gently, tasting salt air and coffee, and the promise of everything they could build together. "I have something to tell you," Amira said against his lips. "I got a job offer yesterday. Teaching position at the state university here. The department head saw my video, said they need professors who understand that literature is about human connection, not just academic theory. Are you going to take it?" "I was going to," she said, her arms tightening around him. But now I'm wondering if there might be two teaching positions available. If maybe a certain former billionaire might want to help me show students that education is about more than preparing for careers. It's about preparing for life. Jonathan laughed, the sound free and genuine in a way he couldn't remember feeling before. I think that former billionaire would love nothing more. 6 months later, they stood together on the same cliff overlooking the Pacific, watching sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. Amira wore a simple white dress and carried wildflowers from the garden she'd helped plant behind their small house. The first home Jonathan had ever chosen for love rather than status. Their wedding was small. Her sister as maid of honor. Tom from hotel security, who'd become an unexpected friend. Mrs. Patterson, fully recovered and delighted to have played a role in their love story. A handful of colleagues from the university where they both now taught. Do you ever miss it? Amira asked as they danced to music from a simple speaker on the porch. The empire, the power, the certainty of wealth. Jonathan looked into her eyes, seeing his future reflected there. Not in quarterly reports or stock prices, but in shared dreams and daily kindnesses, and the promise of growing old with someone who saw him clearly and loved him anyway. I miss the safety, he said honestly, but I don't miss feeling empty. I don't miss being lonely in rooms full of people. I don't miss wondering if anyone would care about me if I lost everything. And now you know? Now I know, he said, spinning her in a circle as the last light faded from the sky. I have everything that matters. Above them, stars emerged one by one, and somewhere in the distance, the ocean whispered its ancient songs about love that transcends boundaries, about courage that transforms everything, and about the revolutionary act of choosing authenticity over safety. They danced until the music ended, then kept dancing in silence. Two people who had found in each other the authentic human connection they'd been searching for all their lives. Love, as it turned out, really could conquer all, when two people were brave enough to let it try.